So what is shaping logistics, air and sea in 2022? Well, three key things. Supply chains are in a state of chaos. We're entering into a new normal, but logistics is booming, so it's good times for us anyway. Supply chain chaos. We've had this 2 years of COVID disruption, which has just been enormous impact worldwide. We've ended up in a place where we've got total disequilibrium in the global supply chain. Too much demand, not enough supply, bottlenecks in the middle, restricting the capability to deliver. In our industry, we ended up with this COVID-induced supply chain gridlock. We had ships, and still do have, parked up outside container ports for days, sometimes weeks, waiting to get into berth. We have airlines putting cargo on passenger seats, or then taking the seats out to put cargo on the passenger decks in order to enable the air freight sector to continue moving. Warehouses got clogged up. Too much product at origin that couldn't sail or fly. Too much product at destination for which there was no onward connection, or in fact demand had collapsed. And then of course we've got the backbone of our industry, the aging demographic in most first world markets of Reg and his friends, the truck drivers. They couldn't go to work, they got COVID, they weren't allowed to go to work. The trucks weren't allowed to travel, borders were closed. The whole thing ended up in this gridlock situation. Who kept it going? You did. Please stand up, everybody. Please stand up. The unsung heroes of global trade are you, the logistics and freight fraternity. You enabled the world economy to continue through this crisis. And now everybody in the world knows about supply chain. Even the bankers are talking about supply chain, and the lawyers, and the school children. We saved the economy, our industry. Now there are ongoing tensions. To the surprise of many under Joe Biden, the attitude to China almost hardened, as if it could have hardened. It's quite astonishing. But despite that, we had this massive surge in imports into the US as Americans were trapped at home with lots of money to spend, but couldn't go out and spend it. So the whole services sector expenditure moved into the at-home online shopping, study at home, school at home, exercise at home, gym at home, kids at home, hi-fi at home, massive. This then caused the gridlock. Then we've got the latest one from just a couple of months ago. From a humanitarian perspective, this is a tragedy. But notwithstanding that, I'm not here to talk about that, from a logistics and supply chain perspective, this has closed off a huge chunk of a landmass, a huge chunk of airspace, closed some of the Black Sea ports, and through sanctions has made it inherently difficult for a lot of companies to continue doing trade and business that they were used to. The impact of this is going to be long and widely felt. There are currently 4.5 million tons of grain in Ukraine that cannot be exported. And before this crisis, most of us probably didn't realize that Ukraine is part of the breadbasket of the world. A major grain exporter, wheat, corn, all that sort of stuff. So we're going to see ramifications on food prices pretty soon. We've got these transport blockages, that transport assets can't get in or out, obvious reasons. And then the sanctions that have been imposed, largely by the West, we need to note, are inhibiting the trade aspects across the whole of the European continent in particular. The Silk Road and rail routes from Asia to Europe, which had seen a resurgence during COVID because all the ships were full, air freight was prohibitively expensive, so the road and rail linkages from Asia to Europe got a lift. About 1 million more containers in 2021 travelled across the Eurasian landmass than in previous years. Now, most of those routes are now closed because the linkages are closed. Then we have this latest one just this last month, the China Zero COVID policy, which was all very well 3 years ago in Wuhan, has now, through the penetration of Omicron, led to unprecedented large-scale lockdowns in cities that have a population of more than 20 million people. That's difficult to imagine the practicalities of how you could actually possibly implement and do that. But of course, the Chinese can do anything they want. So they have. So Shanghai, the world's largest port, one of the top 5 world's cargo airports, was in lockdown for the best part of a month. So trucks couldn't get in and out, people couldn't get in and out, and from our perspective, cargo couldn't get in and out. So we had this knock-on effect of going to Ningbo, going to other airports, and this has raised concern now about the ongoing viability of China as the manufacturing centre of the world. On the left, you see the ship jams. The green is cargo ships, the red is tankers. Of the queue, this is last week, April the 28th, outside the world's biggest container port, the queue of ships waiting to come in. And of course, a lot of them are coming in order to collect, to take the exports out into the Western markets. And the PMI, the manufacturing index, is hovering now below 50, which represents a slowdown. Above 50 represents growth, below 50 represents a slowdown. So there are concerns now. And part of the dynamic zero COVID policy relates to a major political event later in the year, usually sometime between August and October, which is the party conference, which happens every 5 years. And this year is the year when President Xi Jinping is expected to get elected for an unprecedented 3rd term, which has never happened before. And therefore, what would appear in many ways to be a heavy-handed approach to lockdowns is all part of keeping things calm until that happens. Now, once that happens, so in the 4th quarter of the year, I expect we will see a lot of these things start to relax and get back towards some semblance of normal. Now, from the Wall Street perspective, the CEOs are talking supply chain. A recent survey by Alex Partners said that 69% of CEOs surveyed are concerned about their broken supply chains. It was their biggest concern. And I bet at least half of those CEOs, prior to the last couple of years, never gave a thought to the supply chain aspect, right? So this is big, big trouble for global supply chains. I would argue this, what we've been through in the last 2 years, is another nail in the coffin for globalization. I think in 10 years' time, if I get invited back, the globalization landscape will have dissipated into a much more regionalized focus. So people were saying to me last night, things are getting back to normal, Mark. Well, in most of the world they are. But what is this new normal going to be? What's it going to look like? We're stuck in this area of globalization. This is a January forecast from the IMF of GDP growth of the world's major economies. And all of them, except India and Japan, they've reduced their forecast going forward. So even though it feels like we're coming out of the COVID pandemic crisis, there are still other lingering issues that are causing concern about economic growth. Of course, inflation being one of them, being driven, of course, by fuel costs. Fuel cost increases impact everything, not just our freight rates, but they impact the cost of everything. Every goods has to use fuel in order to get to its point of consumption, and therefore, as fuel costs rise, the cost of goods is inevitably going to rise, putting pressure on consumer spending and, of course, on inflation. So we're going to see inflation, we're going to see product shortages, we're going to see the cost of food products increase quite dramatically, and this is going to set the landscape for where we are from a GDP growth perspective. I've previously talked about the demise of globalization, not that it will end, but that it will shift. And there's also been talk about decoupling. And I think from what we've seen in the last 3 years, an element of decoupling is inevitable. Asia Briefing came up with this global decoupling, the West and the rest. Not sure I totally agree with what they're saying there, but there will be an element of decoupling. Interesting in this chart, it's showing the Eastern alignment and the Western alignment, blue being West and red being East, obviously. And then we look at the penetration of China's reach through the Belt and Road Initiative, which now reaches into more than 130 countries where there is a China Belt and Road Initiative underway, completed, or agreed to undertake. So the world is on a journey towards an element of bifurcation into the East and the West. And some countries, of course, are caught in the middle because they need to effectively be friends and allies with both China and the US, right? Who would want to make an enemy out of either of them? So I think as it pertains to supply chain, as supply chain resilience comes to the top of the C-suite agenda, due to all the disruption we've seen, I think it's inevitable that the production relocation discussions will resurface. This is where companies will migrate some, certainly not all, some of their production out of Asia, out of China, back closer to home. Either, for example, in Eastern Europe to serve the Western Europe economies, or to Latin American countries to serve the North American economies. This has been talked about for many years, but we're seeing people actually take action about this. Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, on the recent earnings call, said that recent events, the last couple of years, is going to accelerate their transition to move some production back into the United States. And when we think about relocation of production, typically the focus has been on labor costs. But now, in the 2 decades of rampant globalization, the cost of robotics has more than halved, and the cost of labor has more than doubled. So the rationale for automation in manufacturing in a first world country is offset by the fact that robotic systems can work 24 hours a day. They don't need holiday, they don't need tea breaks or toilet breaks or maternity leave, right? And they're now half the cost they were 20 years ago. Whereas the labor cost, even in places like China, is nowhere near as cheap as it was. It's still less than the US, but China labor rate now is more than Mexico. So, supply chain resilience is the key, and we're going to have next generation of supply chains where production and consumption will be in closer proximity, a regionalized, localized approach. And this, of course, will reduce the lead times, reduce the freight costs, and reduce emissions, because in the context of this, we are conscious about the environment. It's slipped down the priority a bit because there are other things that we need to address. And a regional shorter supply chain will increase the cargo owner's element of control, increase their responsiveness to market demand fluctuations, and increase their overall supply chain resilience. So I can't see any reason why not companies would be thinking about reconfiguring their supply chains. Now, that can't be done overnight. For most major multinational companies, it would be a 2 to 3 year project. They're probably not going to announce their exit too early in that cycle, so we may not see that much action right now, but in the coming 3 to 5 years, I believe we'll see a serious reconfiguration of global supply chains. So, what about China? Well, for any company that is selling into China, it would not make any sense at all to move their supply chain out of China. So going forward, the supply chain strategy is going to be in China for China. So whatever we intend to sell in China, we make in China. Other than that, we might look at China Plus, which is moving some stuff to an alternative in China. Vietnam is the leading contender in that. In fact, Vietnam's exports last month exceeded, for the first time ever, exports from Shenzhen. Vietnam's exports greater than Shenzhen, first time ever. So the in China, for China, the China plus, or the nearshoring strategies. And of course, this has all implications for logistics and freight. So the third aspect, zero in logistics 2022. Well, it's booming, right? Rates are up, revenues are up, profitability's up. If anybody here is not making a healthy profit in the last couple of years, then I wonder what the business is happening. It's a demand-driven business. Supply is tight, rates are high, goods still have to move, right? It's now about the ability to find space for our customers and to have the agility and the flexibility to get the goods from A to B, whatever it takes and whatever routes they might have to travel through. So air freight rates, all-time highs. You guys all know this, I won't spend much time on it. All-time highs, right? Ocean freight rates, all-time highs. And coming back to what I said about the reconfiguration of globalization, if your freight rates have quadrupled in the last 2 years and your transit times have doubled and you're not thinking about nearshoring your production, then I have to question what you're doing in that business, right? On top of all the other things going on. Then we got the global freight forwarding market itself. Of course, there was a huge slump in 2020 as this pandemic started to ripple around the world. And then a huge bounce back in 2021 of 11% growth to a market that's now $284 billion. This is the freight forwarding market in which you guys all participate. The growth obviously will slow down a bit because you can't keep growing at that fast, and now the previous year is higher than before. So a modest growth of 5.7% is predicted for this year, 2022, which will take it to almost a $300 billion sector. And of course, the big guys are making record revenues and record profits. So in 2021, this number here in the bottom right, that's 28 billion euros of additional revenue during the 12 months of 2021 for these 5 companies. Additional revenue. So their revenue grew, their freight forwarding revenue grew by 62% year on year. So a bumpy year for them. Those of you that deal with the shipping lines, you will know they've had a bumpy year. I think Drury estimated about $200 billion of profit for shipping lines. The freight forwarding market on the left-hand side is air freight growth projections, and the right-hand side is the sea freight growth projections. Air freight at 6.1% for this year is the forecast, the growth, after a bumper year last year, and sea freight at 5.2% growth for 2022. Another key factor that's been happening during this crisis is consolidation within the industry, not from the normal one logistics company buying another, but from the extended ecosystem, whereby a lot of people want to get a bigger slice of the pie as the pie is getting bigger. It's now all about end-to-end supply chains. The shipping lines are flush with cash. Now, a shipping line, typically, when they're flush with cash, they go and buy some more ships, right? But there's only so many ships that you're going to need to buy, so they've still got a stack of cash left over. So what they're doing is extending their reach in the supply chain ecosystem. Port terminal operators buying logistics companies. Shipping lines buying logistics companies. Very interesting how they're extending their reach. So the big are going to get bigger, a bit like me during COVID. And for companies that are medium-sized companies, get bought, get niche, which most of you guys are, which is a very powerful position to be in, or get out, I think is the strategy. These are just a selection of what's happened in the last couple of years. Only the last couple of years. So we start with port terminal operators buying logistics companies, and most of these are, how do I turn that off? Most of these are $1 billion+ deals. So DP World paid more than $1 billion for Syncreon, and then more than $1 billion for Imperial Logistics, South African dominant logistics player. Maersk paid $5.5 billion for LF Logistics. Then they've started their own air freight company. MSC bought another Africa logistics company, Bolloré. So we could see a trend here in the developing markets. MSC and Lufthansa together are looking to buy out Alitalia. And then CMA CGM bought Jeffco just a couple of weeks ago. And prior to that, they bought Ingram Services business. DSV bought Agility, DHL bought Hillebrand. Who's going to buy DB Schenker? Stefan's probably got some insight on that, because they'll be next, right? German government, they could do with a bit of cash. And then on the right-hand side, XPO divested their company, their contract logistics business, from the freight forwarding to create GXO, a multi-billion-dollar contract logistics company. Kuehne+Nagel increased their equity stake in Lufthansa. They're now the second largest shareholder in Lufthansa. And we see Daxter chartering their own aeroplanes. And then we see BCOs chartering their own ships. So Lidl, Walmart, IKEA are all chartering their own ships, as FedEx, one of the world's leading air integrators, also charters ships. So this is a trend, and it's going to continue as we come through to the next normal. So in conclusion, what's the outlook for supply chain? Generally, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. So from a supply chain perspective, stormy seas and stormy skies. From the freight and logistics perspective, I think the boom times will continue for the next few years at least. And as SME freight forwarding companies, the enduring strengths that have enabled us to survive and thrive through this challenging period is our knowledge, our networks, and our reputation. And that's what we gain through being part of these membership groups. So I would encourage you to continue to leverage those strengths, build on them, and while we're in it, please ride the wave. Thank you.